Okay, let's call the meeting to order of the City of Greenfield, Royal Groundwater Sustainability Agency. Let's start with roll call.
Chair Thorpe,
Here.
Vice Chair Griva,
Here.
Board Member Rodriguez,
Here.
Board Member Wood,
Here.
Board Member White.
Here.
Okay, will we all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic and one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, public comments from the audience regarding items not on the agenda. This portion of the agenda allows an individual the opportunity to address the GSA on items not on closed session, consent calendar, public hearings, and GSA business. Under state regulations, no action can be taken on non-agenda items, including issues raised under this agenda item. Members of the public should be aware of this when addressing the GSA regarding items not specifically referenced on this agenda. So, do we have any public comments for items not on the agenda? I see none. Okay, we'll move forward to the consent calendar. All matters listed under consent calendar are considered routine and may be approved by one action of the agency unless a request for removal for discussion or explanation is received prior to the time agency votes on the motion to adopt. Do we have any? We have one item under consent calendar, and that's to adopt the minutes of the September 26, 2023 GSA meeting.
I move we adopt the minutes. I'll second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed? Okay, motion carried. Agency business. Receive a Roy Seco Groundwater Sustainability Agency General Manager status report. Full report.
Afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. So I've got three things I want to cover with you today. Again, we don't really have any action items today, but there are still a number of items that are continuing to roll up as we move into implementation under Sigma. The first one I want to talk about, as you recall, last meeting in September, I talked a little bit about the groundwater dependent ecosystems and the work that is ongoing now via a grant in the northern portion of the Salinas Valley. The wetlands group out of Moss Landing is the ones that are actually doing the work. And their task right now is really to identify areas that can be classified as groundwater dependent ecosystems, wet areas, streams, creeks, rivers, and note where they are. Just kind of develop a catalog of them. Ultimately develop a monitoring strategy and then look to see how ultimately they get rolled into whatever suite of management actions and or protections under the overview of the Salinas Valley Basin GSA. Also recall that I talked a little bit about that group and the overall strategy that the Salinas Valley Basin GSA has regarding the Salinas River, and that is to really look at the ongoing Monterey County Water Resource Agency, HCP, Habitat Conservation Plan, planning process to really kind of outline species of concern. The challenge that I think that we in the Valley will have relative to groundwater dependent ecosystems on the Salinas River is the Salinas River isn't a native body of water. It's managed. There's water that's put into it during irrigation season that normally wouldn't be there, that creates certain habitat, especially plant species. In this last drought, we did note there was a fair number of cottonwoods that died out during that drought. In the previous years, plenty of water coming down the river. Cottonwoods did great. And that's clearly an indication that groundwater augmentation through the reservoir operations provided a kind of aquatic habitat that would support cottonwoods. And that's exactly the kind of thing that the idea about GDEs, is kind of in play in normal areas. let's just say you got a body of water that's a creek and you overpump the groundwater beneath it and you lose some of the riparian corridor in the area. Well, that would clearly be an area where you've got maybe overpumping in an area and potentially impactful of the habitat that would be supported by that creek. The other thing that I mentioned in this area was that we were going to bring Gus Yates to provide a hydrologic overview of the issue. Because currently most of the folks that are doing the work are biologists, which is fine. You know, I mean, we're definitely want biologists to be concerned with plant and animal species. You know, us engineers always have a little trouble with critters and plants. But the point is that he brought a perspective that they hadn't heard. We had been provided some information from I'm gonna draw a blank, the senior moment, Mr. Chairman. Sorry about that. They've been provided some information about areas and how to go about developing GDEs and developing overlays of GIS information. And Gus brought a pretty practical, pragmatic element in that once you do all that, you really need to go to photos like Google Images and see whether the GIS layers are identifying a stock pond or if it really is a little wetland. That's one thing, just to kind of do a ground truthing. And the second thing that we did is we talked about, kind of with some of the criteria, and Gus brought in this concept, and others have as well, that a depth of about 30 feet is about the most that you're going to get, plant species in terms of roots. Oak trees are an outlier, and they can go really deep, really broad, but generally speaking, around riparian corridors, 30 feet is kind of the cutoff. Now, for us in the Arroyo Seco River is unregulated, and hence most of the riparian that's along the edge is kind of bulletproof. It did okay during the last round of droughts. That's primarily because the river and the way it's operated over eons, continues to provide adequate water to take care of the riparian corridor that's there. But Gus also noted in our GSP that there's such a drop, such a difference between the top of our groundwater aquifer and the bottom of the riverbed, and the transmissivities, the rate in which water can move through the ground, are so great that there's very little impact in terms of, even if we lower that top of the groundwater basin, it's not really going to have much of an impact on how water moves through the soil or how it impacts plant species and animal species and birds and fish. Except when we get to about a mile of the confluence with the Salinas River, but that's outside of our boundary. So that's good news for us. But nevertheless, we're still in a process that's just identifying where these groundwater dependent ecosystems are. And I think Gus' information was really helpful. And to their credit, the group that's doing the work asked Gus to come back and help them. So I think that's good for us, and it's good for the Salinas Valley Basin GSA. That's item one. I'll stop and pause, see if there's any questions.
Any questions from board members? We'll go to public comment.
Let me get through the other two, and then we'll open it up. We'll see if they're. The second item I want to talk about was the only item that we really covered in the advisory committee meeting this last month. We had on the agenda both to cover fees and demand management, but we didn't get through all the fees in the time allotted and went over just talking about fees. We spent a long time. We went through item by item. There are 9 elements that are currently in the scope of work, which, by the way, does include the Arroyo Seco's management area difference than the rest of the forebay. It's one piece. But there are many others. Some of them are aimed at equity issues in disadvantaged communities, to how we're going to continue to to actually separate or calculate how much of the fees get paid by urban and agriculture, and other items that are important to note. I think that the gist of it is that the Sage Valley Basin GSA really hadn't budgeted this level of effort, and they don't have the resources to get it done in time. And I think they got some direction. They, being the staff, got some direction, but I think they're a long ways away from either addressing denied items or, really developing a new approach to fees. I did hear a pretty consistent, there's going to be a tier 1, which is their administrative fee, and a tier 2 that'll be sub-basin by sub-basin applied, and that'll be, wrapped around whatever management actions or projects that go into those various sub-basins. I think that's a good thing. I think that makes sense for all of us and for the entire valley. There are some folks that would like to see a uniform fee for everybody, of course. So there was a lot of discussion in that kind of context. But my real message to you is that we are a long ways away from having an update that I can bring to you, as a board to interact with, and talking about fees that are going to be levied in the 4-bay and in the Arroyo Seco Cone Management area. Member Wood, you were there. Do you have anything to add?
No, lots of discussion. Good discussion. I mean, it was bantied around a lot, and lots more to go.
Yeah, I thought it was productive. I can say that, when we're talking about disadvantaged communities and making some sort of adjustments for them in urban areas, it was kind of noted that it's a relatively small number and may not warrant a whole lot of work. And under Sigma, they can't make any real adjustments, for that. It's got to be the same across the board unless you develop special tax. And so that might not be as important as some of the larger issues that had to do with how the fees get developed and some of the equity issues. On our particular category, that is the item about the Arroyo Seco Cone Management Area being looked at differently pursuant to our implementation agreement. There were some folks that didn't think that was appropriate. And I told them that we had a process in place, and I asked them to let that process work out. And while I think that satisfied most people, it didn't satisfy all.
That's true. Thank you for bringing that up, because it needed to be. It was a little uncomfortable, but it needs to be talked about.
It was a little uncomfortable. It was a little uncomfortable after the meeting too, but that's another story. Yeah, question.
Who attended the meeting? Was it the three of you?
It's the advisory committees for the Salinas Valley Basin GSA. So there's like 19 people. Oh, and it was a joint meeting with the board of directors.
Right.
I forgot to mention that. I apologize.
It wasn't our implementation field that we.
No,
I was thinking this was a subcommittee
Jerry.
No. It's the Salinas Valley Basin Advisory Committee, which is a large body.
Right.
And it was held jointly with their board members. So we had like 24 people in the room.
Yeah. And from our group, it was Curtis, myself, and Jerry Laura. Is that it? Jerry Laura.
Jerry was there, yeah.
Yeah. And anybody else besides the two of us?
Just the two of you.
Okay.
And myself. There's no three. We were well represented. But I think it's important to note that they are bringing that out to the advisory committee, and they are going to play a role in the development of these fees. And it's a good venue because it engages the whole valley, and that way I think the board has the ability to let some of the vetting occur there rather than board meetings. That's probably a good thing for them.
Well, and I think we've heard in the past that the question that came up, what about the Arroyo Seco? I think we have people that weren't paying attention a couple of years ago, and maybe some new people on that board that don't realize that, we basically, use another term, we have a contract with spelling out how we're going to pay for things and do and cooperate with each other. And I don't think that's just universally understood or there just doesn't seem to be. So I'm glad you guys had a chance to talk about it.
Yeah, it will give us a chance to talk about it. The one thing that I would say is, we get quite a bit of service from the Salinas Valley Basin GSA in our management area. They do provide that annual report. We're part of everything that goes on. While we certainly have got the authority to exert, thus far we haven't really had any conflicts, and I think we good, pretty good value for all of the ratepayers. Essentially pay the same right now, and we might make some adjustments, but I think we ought to consider all the value that we get. And the city, of course, has got, it hasn't been part of the collection on the urban front because it's the GSA, right? And you guys have not elected to provide, to collect any fees from the city. So there is that small advantage that we get. And I think that's maybe not so small, but it's important. Something that the city always wanted. We've been able to hold on to that. So the issue of demand management didn't come up, but we're scheduling a meeting probably the first week in December to take that on, because that's a whole nother big issue to grapple with. Putting both of them in a 2-hour meeting, I just knew kind of from the start that we weren't going to get there. Okay, and my last item is the implementation committee. That's the Forebay implementation committee. That was held yesterday. And the principal item that we talked about had to do with an alternative methodology for determining groundwater extraction. And the alternative methodology is to use evapotranspiration as measured via satellites in large areas, and then to correlate that to how much water is pumped and ultimately applied to that ground. And the idea is that clearly what comes out of the ground and gets applied to the crops isn't all going to go up in evapotranspiration. A certain amount of it will, a certain amount is going to return to the ground. And the authors and the implementers of this methodology don't care about that. That's water still going back into the ground, so still part of the groundwater. What they're interested in is how much water is actually used. And the only way it's used is in plant growth, development of, leafy green grapes, beans, whatever, and then the loss of that water through evaporation and transpiration. And it may not work everywhere. It's a pilot study. We're going to look at the Forebay in the Upper Valley, and with landowners that want to volunteer to be part of it. And I think those two subbasins are really good places to start. A little different, but very similar in that, it's hotter in the Upper Valley and maybe in the Forebay than other areas. It's not a confined aquifer system. So any water that doesn't get used through evapotranspiration does return to the ground. So, it's a good place to start a pilot study to see what we get in the way of data. And the alternatives, what we've got in front of us in terms of Sigma, is DWR wants us to improve our groundwater monitoring network. While we have a good one, it's not 100% complete. And the expansion of GEMS may not be the best fit in all areas. As an example, there's a fair amount of grazing lands in some of the edges. Grazing lands don't always get a whole lot of irrigation. A lot of it's just dependent upon rainfall. And, maybe you could use this to augment this approach, this evapotranspiration approach, to look at how much water was used compared to rainfall. Note that there's no pumping in those areas, and, call it, kind of a box checked in terms of developing a better understanding of how much water gets used, especially groundwater in a basin. So there's some interesting applications that could come out of this methodology. So I thought we had a good dialogue around it. And the guys that are going to do this are the Irrigation Institute out of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. The only other thing go ahead.
I know there's probably a lot that's going to have to be developed to make that all work, but do you have any idea how they're going to address the confined aquifer versus, for instance, as you travel north and not as much of that irrigation water is able to get back to the groundwater. How do you think they're gonna implement that into there? Just some sort of a,
Combined aquifers don't work. Strictly speaking, they don't work, but you could develop a methodology where you look at, how much water is pumped and what the evapotranspiration is in that area and develop different correlation. But that would, that was going to take some work, because if you think about the pressure 180, what happens in and around Castroville isn't the same as what happens around Gonzales. You start getting southerly in that large zone, that clay starts to break up and it's not quite as an issue. It's not quite as confined. And so it's complex. So, we'd have to work through some of those details if we, do indeed go to implement this basin-wide. So like I say, this is a pilot. We see what kind of data we get, see if it makes sense, and then we can take the next step. I can tell you, it's likely to be a whole lot less expensive in the long run than to doing a big gyms expansion. Because you can get, like I was saying, these grasslands, you could get a lot of area done pretty quickly, pretty easily, with not much expense.
well, everything has a margin of error in it, and it seems like if the cost is low enough, that even if they can get the margin of error at a minimum, that'd be the most economical way to do it, just to do it and say, well, we think this is 91% accurate or whatever, and versus spending millions.
Well, think about adding meters to every single well that's out there and then getting them all calibrated on a regular basis in terms of expense. Because that's where the kind of the bookends are developing some, remote methodology versus adding in wells. And even taking the next step, I know they're going to actually add, or already have, add transmitters on some of those meters in the CSIP area where they're able to remotely gather the information and monitor it. So, there's a wide difference in cost, implementation, infrastructure. And, GEMS has been a great program, but it's only as good as the data that we put into it. And, some folks don't have meters. Some folks use electric information to make the calculation based upon how much efficiencies they get out of the motors and the pumps bowls themselves. So it's all a calculation. To your point, is it 91%? Is it 85? Is it 97? We don't know.
So, sorry, part of the presentation talked about the availability of the data, and that you can see not only your data, but you can see your neighbor's data. Is that a good thing? I mean, just in general?
Well, that's the direction that we're going to head. I mean, where we're headed under Sigma is DWR capturing all this use data and making it public. I mean, that's going to happen. So I got mixed emotions about it. But if it's just like a general data dump of how much you use on an annual basis, that's probably not so bad. But if we break it up into increments of time and we get into strategies of irrigation, I don't think that's a good thing. I think that borders on all of your, various recipes for making the kind of crops that you've got unique. But, in terms of water usage, everybody's going to see everybody's data eventually, or at least have access to it. The other thing, they are looking for volunteers. And so you can go online now and find, the infrared, the satellite imagery, if you know how to look for it to get evapotranspiration raw data out, just in terms of kind of ranges. But the next step is to go in and see how much water is actually pumped to get that. And then having transparency there, I know that they're going to be respectful of that, but ultimately, if we use this kind of methodology, everybody will know what that looks like. Eventually, yeah. I will note they're going to take historical data. They're going to use 2017 to 2021, which is probably a good slice of hydrologic data because it was just coming off a pretty bad drought. I think 2017 was pretty wet, and then there was a couple dry years, a couple wet years in there. So it's probably a good a good section to at least start with, because one of the other issues, of course, is how much rainfall gets in the mix and how does that change how much water you pump and when. So it's interesting, and I think it's worth investigating. So stay tuned. That's my report, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions or comments from board members? We'll take it out to the public. Is there any public comments? I see Mr. Versick.
Thank you, Chair. Tom Versick speaking. A quick point on the second of Mr. Weeks' reports regarding what occurred at the joint meeting and the 9 items that were discussed. And just my 2 cents is that the Arroyo Seco GSA should not be shy about using the term management area, and also saying that it's one of 2 management areas in the SVB GSA's jurisdiction, because there's also the Corral del Tierra. And I also agree with, I don't remember who said it, it might have been Mr. Weeks or it might have been one of the board members, but that there are many people who are involved, not staff, but other interests who either have not paid attention or not paying attention, or just for their own reasons choose to live in denial about facts, things that actually occurred, and the history, and in my view, many times the law as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Versick. Do we have any other public comments?
No, but I have finally one item to add.
Okay.
I kind of got through my senior moment, and it's the Nature Conservancy data is what's been used to develop the GED approach before Gus got to them. So before Gus came, we were using just the Nature Conservancy's approach. They've issued a document. It's online through the portal for Sigma, and it uses a series of GIS layers. And Gus's first comment was what I told you. So that's great, but you probably really ought to go look at a picture to make sure that you're really looking at a body of water, not a stock pond. And he had a couple examples and some other things. So I thought it was a really good practical approach to looking at what a groundwater dependent ecosystem is and then how to define it.
Okay, no more public comments. Okay, Government Code Section 54956.9, conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation, significant exposure to litigation pursuant to paragraph 2 or 3 of subdivision D of section 54956.9 of the Government Code. One case. Do we have any public comments? No public comments. We will adjourn to closed session. Okay, we'll reconvene to open session. Is there anything to report?
No, there's nothing to report.
Okay. Well, being no further business, we'll adjourn the meeting. He's married.